Hello and welcome. My name is Kelly Woods. I'm the Associate Director of Career Advising here at Mount Holyoke College's Career Development Center.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Malloy. I'm a Senior Accommodation Coordinator in Accessibility Services at Mount Holyoke College.
And we are so pleased to be with you today with the Director of Training at the New England ADA Center, Kathy Gibbs, for a workshop, the ADA Employment and Disabilities, Should You Disclose? This program is being co-hosted by Mount Holyoke College's Weissman Center for Leadership, Accessibility Services, and the Career Development Center. And with that, we're pleased to introduce Kathy Gibbs.
Hello, everybody. As Kelly said, I'm Kathy Gibbs. We're going to be talking about ADA employment and disclosure. I'm with the New England ADA Center, which is in Boston. And we are one of 10 ADA centers that were established by the federal government to provide information, technical assistance, material, and training on the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're the one up here, obviously, in New England. We are not enforcement agencies. We really deal with trying to get the ADA implemented voluntarily. We all have the same toll-free number, this 1-800-949-4232 number, and it connects via your area code. So if you've got an area code that's in New England, you will get our center in Boston. If you've got an area code that's from California, you're going to get the Pacific ADA Center. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about the structure of the ADA, the definition of the ADA, some pre-employment issues, reasonable accommodation, undue hardship, confidentiality. We'll answer any of your questions that we haven't addressed during the presentation, and then some resources. So this is going to be a really basic overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act with the focus on reasonable accommodation, pre-employment issues, and disclosure. The structure of the ADA is that there are 5 titles. And the first title is really the one that we're talking about, it's employment. And it applies when a business or an organization has 15 or more employees. So if you're going to be working for a very small business or a very small nonprofit organization, the ADA probably is not going to apply to your situation. However, we're lucky because in Massachusetts, we have a comparable employment law which applies when there are 6 or more employees. And if you're working for a municipality like a small town, Title II requires compliance with employment non-discrimination no matter how many employees there are. So if there's 1 employee, 1 town clerk, that person has rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's about 100 different definitions of disability out there, but the ADA has a very specific definition of disability, and that's an individual who has a record of or is regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And here are examples of major life activities. Caring for oneself. It can be that somebody physically can't care for themselves, or because of a mental health issue, they're no longer able to care for themselves. They're having difficulty caring for themselves. Performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and working. So it's quite broad, and in addition to that, major bodily functions are considered to be major life activities. So functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, which is going to pull in people who have cancer, digestive issues, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain-based issues, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. The question becomes, is the major life activity substantially limited? And the ADA says that we are to compare it with most people, and it should not require extensive analysis. Congress really wants to see broad coverage of who's going to be pulled in under this definition of disability. So for an example, Eager has anxiety disorder. It substantially affects their ability to concentrate, to learn, to read, and to think. So Eager has a disability under the ADA. Another example, Sarada has diabetes. The condition requires her to follow a strict regimen. She must adhere to a strict diet, eat meals on a regular schedule, and ensure proper balance between her caloric intake and her level of physical activity. She's got a disability under the ADA. Jose is diagnosed with depression. He'll be fine for months, but a few times a year he becomes severely depressed and has difficulty sleeping and concentrating. The depression usually lasts a week. He has a disability under the ADA. So even though he doesn't have depression all the time, this is just months, a few months, and he'll be fine, and then he might have an episode. He's still considered to have a disability, and he has a right to reasonable accommodation that's going to address his depression throughout the year. I think it's important to know that the ADA protects qualified people with disabilities. So you really do have to have the skill, the experience, the education, and other job-related requirements of the position. And with or without reasonable accommodation, be able to perform the essential functions of the position. So let's talk a little bit about this issue of, before you're on the job, what kind of questions an employer can ask, what you should be answering. From the employer's perspective, disability-related questions are prohibited on application forms, in job interviews, and in background or reference checks. So any questions are prohibited regarding the nature or the severity of the disability, the condition causing the disability, prognosis, or treatment. So even if you choose to bring up that you have a disability, the employer really is not supposed to be poking around and asking a lot of questions about how severe it is, or what kind of treatment you're under, or are you going to be getting better, or any of those kind of questions. It's really up to you to control how much information you provide about disability. So from the employer's perspective, again, they should really be focusing on the applicant's ability to perform the job. They can ask you to describe how you would do job tasks. They can ask you to demonstrate doing job tasks. And they need to ask all applicants in the job category to do this, except an employer may ask a particular applicant with a disability to describe or demonstrate how they would perform a function, even if they don't ask other applicants, under the situation where the employer could reasonably believe that the person will have difficulty performing job functions because of a known disability. The known disability thing is kind of key. The employer may also ask a particular applicant about whether or not they're going to need reasonable accommodation, what kind of reasonable accommodation they need. Again, the employer could, if the employer could reasonably believe the applicant will need a reasonable accommodation because of a known disability. So the question becomes, how is the disability known? Well, sometimes the disability is known because it's obvious. The applicant uses a wheelchair, the applicant is blind, maybe the applicant has Tourette's syndrome and has some uncontrollable movements or uncontrollable speech affects. Or it could be the applicant has disclosed that they have usually a non-apparent disability. Or maybe the applicant has disclosed that they need a reasonable accommodation on the job. So these are all reasons, sorry, let me turn my phone off. Sorry, everybody. These are all reasons why an employer might know that somebody has a disability, known disability. So some considerations in terms of disclosure for you are, will I be screened in or will I be screened out by the hiring process, the application and the interview. A lot of employers are very disability friendly and they really want to be hiring people with disabilities. And our agency is like that. We really want to be hiring people with disabilities. And so that becomes an important issue when we let that be known through our sort of job advertisement process. And so we are very interested in knowing whether or not somebody has a disability. Another consideration really is, should I wait to disclose and request reasonable accommodation till I get the job. How is my employer going to feel if I don't disclose and discuss reasonable accommodation during the interview process, and then maybe day 1 or day 2 or whatever, you bring up the issue that you have a disability and you need reasonable accommodation? How is that going to affect your relationship with the employer? Is it going to feel like they were a little bit deceived, or is that an okay thing to do? I know some people are concerned about not getting hired because they disclose and request reasonable accommodation during the job interview. But really, this is an individual choice that you really need to make. And then another consideration for job seekers is really, is the disability somewhat, or is it completely obvious? And if it's obvious, I think you want to be able to address the employer's concerns. I mean, in this situation, we have Jonathan who has autism. He has difficulty understanding social cues, body language, and vocal qualities. He has difficulty understanding and expressing emotion. Jonathan has been told by others that his behavior is odd, or maybe he knows his behavior is atypical. And so the employer is sitting there kind of wondering a little bit about, Jonathan, what is going on? And in this kind of a situation, I think it would be important to disclose that you have a condition, could name it as being autism, and really to talk about how it affects you, and also to make sure that you're really answering what you consider the employer's concerns about whether or not you're going to be able to do the job. So if you're choosing to disclose about disability, you really want to focus on the job qualifications, your job qualifications, not really focusing on your disability. But you do want to solicit and respond to the employer's concerns. So what kind of concerns do you think the employer is going to have? And you also want to be prepared with solutions. How is the disability going to affect you on the job? What are some solutions that you've come up with to address that? We recommend that you avoid medical terms or jargon, that you really focus on your present credibility versus your past problems. It's certainly okay to say, in my previous job, these are the accommodations that I received. They were very helpful. You want to stress anything positive, your current activities. And you also are going to want to really talk about your learning needs and style, so that the employer is really prepared to meet those learning needs, and to be able to really figure out with you, how are you best going to be able to function on the job. After a job is offered, but before the employment actually starts, this is where an employer may ask disability-related questions and require medical examinations. So the job offer may be conditioned on the results of the post-offer disability-related questions and medical examinations. And at this point, disability-related questions and medical examinations at the what's called the post-offer stage do not have to be related to the job. So the door is really wide open at this point in terms of what an employer can ask about your medical history, your current medical situation. Most employers don't really want to go on a fishing expedition. Most employers, if they even are going to ask disability-related questions and require medical exams, really want to keep it to the job functions. They don't want to know your whole history. But this is the point at which an employer may ask these questions. If the employer decides to rescind the job because of information that they receive, they need to have considered whether or not there was reasonable accommodation that was going to support you to do the job. So they have to have gotten information that's really going to indicate that you're not able to do your job because of a disability. Now, on the job disclosure, you're not required to, unless you want an accommodation, and you can request the accommodation at any time. It could be day one, it could be before you even start, maybe you've got the job, and at that point, you really want to sit down with the employer and discuss what kind of accommodations you need. You know, it could be a year in, it could be 6 months in, but you're not required to disclose that you have a disability, really, unless you need an accommodation. And one thing that we strongly suggest, because we probably get the most calls about this kind of situation, we get calls from employers and we get calls from employees where somebody's work performance is slipping, and now the employee comes forward and says that they have a disability, that maybe they have depression or an anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, or really any kind of thing, a learning disability. So they're requesting at the point they're being disciplined. You really want to think about requesting your accommodation before your work performance slips, because an employer does not have to rescind discipline. So we've got a situation here with a fellow who has major depression and is often late for work because of medication side effects that make him groggy. His work hours are 9 to 5:30, but he often arrives at 9:30 or even 10. His job responsibilities involve contact with sales representatives who depend on him to answer urgent marketing questions and expedite special orders. The employer disciplines Alan for tardiness, stating that continued failure to arrive promptly will result in termination. So at this point, Alan explains that he is late because of a disability and needs to work a later schedule. The employer may discipline him because he did violate a conduct standard that is job related. However, the employer also has to consider reasonable accommodation, barring undue hardship, and undue hardship is always a balance to a reasonable accommodation request, but he has to consider reasonable accommodation that's going to enable Alan to meet this standard. So yeah, perhaps it's that he could serve the company's sales representatives by working a schedule of 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. And the company's going to have to determine really whether or not that's an undue hardship, whether or not that's an accommodation that they consider to be reasonable. So what are reasonable accommodations? They're modifications or adjustments to the job application process, to the work environment, or the manner and circumstances under which the position is performed, and also adjustments that enable equal benefits and privileges of employment. So in this situation, we have somebody who's deaf. She applies for a job and is granted an interview. She asks the employer to provide a sign language interpreter for the interview. Is this the employer's responsibility? It's amazing how many employers think it's not their responsibility, but in fact, it is the employer's responsibility. This is a reasonable accommodation that Natasha needs during the hiring process. Now, most reasonable accommodation applies on the job, and I think that's probably what most of you are concerned about. But I think it's really important to realize that an employer is not required to lower quality or production standards because of an employee's disability. The whole purpose of reasonable accommodation is really to support the employee to do the job and to do it to the employer's satisfaction. So it's not an excuse for not doing a job. The purpose of it is really to support the person to do the job. Now, here are some examples of reasonable accommodation. It could be reallocating what are called marginal job functions. Employees must be able to do the essential job functions, but perhaps you're having difficulty with a small part of your job, and that would be considered a marginal job function. But very often something is something that the person was hired to perform, like a magazine editor must be able to edit, a bus driver must drive. We would look at things like what's the percentage of time spent on the task, the consequence of not performing the task, and also are there other employees available who could do the task? So perhaps something is a very small part of your job. There are other employees around who could do that. And so that would really be considered a marginal job functions. Providing qualified readers and interpreters. It could be somebody has a severe learning disability or they're blind. Interpreters are usually going to be for people who are deaf. The ADA does not address interpreting for people for foreign language needs. So here we've got an interpreter in a group. And then we also have what's called video remote interpreting, which is a sort of an offsite interpreter, and then the technology allows the person who is deaf to participate. Another example of reasonable accommodation would be to obtain or modify equipment. It could be noise canceling headsets, which might be helpful for somebody who has ADHD or has great difficulty concentrating. It could be something like a daylight sun lamp, which would be helpful for somebody who has depression. This is technology for somebody who is hard of hearing. It's called an assistive listening device. And then a part-time or modified work schedule is another accommodation. So we have this situation with Mario, who has a history of bipolar disorder. He's been hospitalized in the past. He's able to do his job, but is struggling privately. His psychiatrist wants to see him twice a week for monitoring and medication fine-tuning. The only times available are Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2:30 p.m. Mario tells his supervisor that he'll come to work early, stay late, or do some of the work at home on weekends. So that is a possible reasonable accommodation. The employer is really going to have to figure out what is the effect of it on his business. But that would be a fairly typical reasonable accommodation, some flexibility in terms of your schedule, having a modified work schedule. Another reasonable accommodation is modification of policies. So it could be that ABC agency has a no pets policy, an employee with epilepsy has a seizure alert dog. In this situation, XYZ company does not permit employees to have food or beverages at their desks. And due to medication that Alberto is taking for his disability, he has a dry, cottony mouth, which is a fairly typical condition when you are taking medication for a lot of people. Alberto requests that he be able to drink water at his desk. This is a modification of a policy. So this would be something that XYZ company would really need to consider modifying that policy. Another reasonable accommodation is leave. So a lot of people who have medical conditions need to take leave. They might need to take leave sort of on an intermittent basis. They might need to take leave for a fairly long period of time. There's no outside limit to how much leave an employee is allowed to take. It's a little different than the Family Medical Leave Act, which restricts leave to 12 weeks in a calendar year. The ADA doesn't have those kinds of restrictions. So leave is a fairly typical accommodation for somebody who has a medical condition or somebody maybe who has a mental health condition and needs to take leave as a result of that. Here are some more reasonable accommodations examples. Teleworking, of course, that is what we're all doing now. So it is not as much of a reasonable accommodation, but when we get back to normal, hopefully, really a lot of employers don't like people from working from home. And so I think we're going to see sort of a resurgence of people working back in their office. But telework really would need to be a possible reasonable accommodation for somebody with a disability who maybe has great difficulty getting into the office. They might have a very long commute. Maybe they have severe arthritis, and it's really difficult for them to get going in the morning, and they've got an hour-long drive, and by the time they get to the office, they're exhausted already. So teleworking might make sense. Other reasonable accommodation examples are meeting with the supervisor more frequently. So this might be somebody who has a learning disability and really needs more frequent contact with their supervisor. Maybe they need structured feedback. So the feedback is really important. They might need to have the employer really show them how to do the job rather than just telling them how to do a task. Another possible reasonable accommodation are partitions or workstation set up so that somebody has a bit of a quiet environment. Maybe they're easily distracted and they really need to have some more quiet space. There may not be private offices for the person to work in, but they could put up some kind of a partition with their workstation set up. And then organizational tools might be helpful for somebody who has ADHD or somebody with a learning disability. This would be something that the employer would need to provide, like helping the person with lists or Post-it notes or organizers or highlighter pens. So the door is really quite open in terms of what kind of reasonable accommodation an employer is required to provide. Now, the balance to reasonable accommodation is if it would be an undue hardship for the employer. And here are some of the things that go into determining whether or not something is an undue hardship. It could be something that is unduly costly, like equipment, or it could be something that's extensive, like indefinite leave. Yes, the employer has an obligation to provide leave, but they really don't need to hold the job open indefinitely. Somebody might be out for a year. We got a call from an employer who had an employee who was out for 2 years, and he said, we really need to fill this job. We really can't keep the job open any longer. We've got other employees who are filling in, but it's really becoming burdensome for them. So it could be something that's extensive, that's substantial, or that's disruptive, like a modified work schedule. We had a call from a college, and one of their professors wanted his classes to start 15 minutes later. He wanted each of his classes to start 15 minutes later for a disability-related reason. And the school called us to ask whether or not they needed to do that. Now, all the classes started at the same time, and students needed the time between classes to get from class to class. So this kind of a modified work schedule really would have been very disruptive. So it would have been considered an undue hardship. So how to communicate your reasonable accommodation request? Well, first of all, it's the employee's or the person with the disability's obligation to make the request. You do not have to say ADA. You do not have to say reasonable accommodation. You may use plain language. You really don't have to bring up sort of the legal issues. You can just say what it is that you need. Maybe you're just going to say, I'm having difficulty with a particular task, or I need some flexibility in my work hours. The employer and the employee are supposed to get together and identify what the appropriate accommodations are. And this is called the informal interactive process. Now, if the employer says yes, you don't have to have an informal interactive process. You've got an okay situation. And the accommodation must be effective, not necessarily the one the person requested. So in this situation, Ron has a severe learning disability and has great difficulty reading. His supervisor sends him detailed memorandum, which he has trouble understanding. However, he has no difficulty understanding oral communication. So he requests that his supervisor records messages and send them to him as voice files. The supervisor asks whether text-to-speech software on his computer would accomplish the same objective, and the employee agrees that it would. So since both accommodations are effective, the employer may choose to provide the text-to-speech software. So it really is ultimately the employer's decision on what kind of an accommodation somebody has got to get, but it's got to be effective. So these are all terms that are fairly general. We really look at them on a case-by-case situation, looking at the details about what the person's difficulty is and what the job tasks are. So when you're communicating your need for a reasonable accommodation, you want to be positive. I'm really enjoying my job. I would be more productive if. You also really want to emphasize the benefit to the employer as well as yourself. You want to come up with ideas and suggestions. So don't be a problem solver. You really want to emphasize that this is going to support you to be able to do your job better. The informal interactive process would be really discussion of what kind of limitations is the employee experiencing? What are the specific job tasks that are problematic as a result of these limitations? And how do these limitations affect the employee and the employee's job performance? So this would be the discussion that the employee and the employer would have to really determine what kind of accommodation is going to be most appropriate in any given situation. So we're looking at the accommodations, and the other thing we suggest is, once you have accommodations in place, the employee and the employer should really meet at a specified date to assess the effectiveness of the accommodations and also to determine whether different or additional accommodations are needed. Because you don't want to just provide the accommodations and not check back. You really are going to want to make sure that this is something that's working out for the employee and also working out for the employer in terms of the person being able to get their job done. We often get questions about whether employers can require documentation of disability or the person's need for reasonable accommodation and how much documentation they can require. Some employers don't really require any documentation. You make your request, you tell them as much as you want to tell them. Some employers really don't want to know a whole lot about your medical history or disability, but an employer may require documentation where the disability is not obvious and or the need for the accommodation is not obvious. And very often it's not obvious. So, but employers should really specify what kind of information they are seeking regarding the disability and its functional limitations and the need for the reasonable accommodation. They should be specifying that so that the employee is getting that information from their medical provider. And the employee can be asked to sign a limited release, allowing the employer to submit a list of specific questions to the healthcare or the vocational professional. So we have a situation here. I would consider this to be reasonable documentation. Maria's physician sent an email explaining that Maria has diabetes and that she must test her blood sugar levels several times a day to ensure that her insulin level is safe to avoid a hyperglycemic reaction. And then depending on the results of the blood test, Maria might have to take insulin. The email requests that Maria be allowed 3 or 4 10-minute breaks each day to test her blood and if necessary to take insulin. So the employer, the physician has really provided very reasonable documentation. It explains her disability. Doesn't just say that she has a disability, but it really explains what her disability is and also showing that it is an ADA disability, that it's not just sort of a medical condition, but it's going to be considered an ADA disability. And then what the results are, and then also being specific about the reasonable accommodation and why she needs it. So that's good documentation. Here we have a situation where an employee tells her employer that she has asthma and needs an air filter. Can the employer request that the employee provide documentation? Well, yes. The employer can request documentation concerning that the person has asthma, and also whether or not it's a disability. Remember again that it has to be substantially limiting a major life activity. And the documentation needs to identify not just that the person has a disability, but what the problem is in the workplace that requires an air filter or any other reasonable accommodation. Now, we often get this issue. Employers are often concerned that if we allow one employee to do it, then everyone will ask for it. And the air filter was a perfect example. We had a situation where somebody had multiple sclerosis. They were very affected by heat. She really needed to have an air conditioner. Other employees did not have air conditioners, and other employees were asking for air conditioners once they found out this particular employee had one. So employers often don't want to provide reasonable accommodation or hesitant to provide reasonable accommodation, flexible work schedule, equipment, whatever it is, because they're really concerned that other employees are going to want to know why the person is getting special treatment and is also going to want whatever accommodation that the person gets. But it's really the employer's obligation to make an individual assessment of this person's disability, this person's need request, the employer's resources and situations at the time of the request. So at this point, we've got the person who needs the air filter, got a disability, need request. The employer's resources are not going to result in undue hardship for the employer. So the employer really needs to meet that reasonable accommodation request. And that gets us into the final topic, which really is confidentiality. An employer may not disclose that an employee is receiving a reasonable accommodation because this amounts basically to a disclosure that a person has a disability. Disability and medical information must be treated as a confidential medical record. So that information should be kept separate from the employee's general personnel file. It really has to be treated as what's called a confidential medical record. And no information should be disclosed by the employer to other employees. So beware of the friendly workplace. We have a situation here where Cameron works in a friendly agency. He takes leave due to mental health issues. He's only discussed this with the Human Resources Department, so he hasn't even discussed this with his supervisor, which is fine. You do not have to discuss your reasonable accommodation request, particularly for something like leave with your supervisor or manager. You can go directly to the Human Resources Department. But so in this situation, his coworkers ask his supervisor why he's on leave, if he's in the hospital, whether they should send a card. All of those are inappropriate questions for the employer to respond to. And in fact, in this situation, all his supervisor really knows is that he's on leave because all he's done is he's discussed it with the Human Resources Department. So that's the presentation. We've got your questions, and I know Kelly and Caitlin have gathered some questions. So let's talk about things that we need to fine tune here or that really weren't addressed during the presentation. Caitlin or Kelly, do we have some questions?
Yes, let's take a look at the list of questions that we had shared with us. And I think you answered the vast majority of them, Kathy. We had questions about whether it was necessary to disclose a disability in the workplace and how you can determine if you should. And in a job search, at what point would be the appropriate stage to be making that disclosure, and if they need to have proof, if accommodations at work are needed. This is a question that does come up, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. You were really clear about what the employer's obligation is in that process, but I'm curious to know, I sometimes have people ask, is it okay if I provide the item or the accommodation that I need? Maybe I need a noise canceling headset. Is it okay if I'm doing that? Am I setting myself up for a problem if I don't tell somebody, for example, that I'm doing this because I need an accommodation? Or is it inappropriate that I'm purchasing something when I have the means to do so? What is your thought around sort of that balance?
So is this a situation where the employee or what the students or employees is responsible for, basically employee is responsible for providing the accommodation, but if the, I mean the employer, but if the employee chooses to purchase it themselves, like the noise canceling headsets or something like that, I don't see any problems with that. And I mean, that might particularly work if you really don't want to disclose that you have a disability, but you need some kind of accommodations, then it would be fine for the employee to go ahead and make the arrangements. But I'm not sure I'm exactly understanding and answering the question.
It's really, no, it's exactly that. I think I sometimes have had, if I don't want to make the disclosure, can I just go ahead and make arrangements? Or maybe I work in a friendly workplace, and so when I say I just need Tuesday afternoons off and I'm going to work on Thursday night, is that okay? And my boss says, sure. Do I need to follow through? When is there a moment where perhaps I might want to be more cautious about making a more formal declaration of my need in conjunction with my disability versus sort of working within the parameters of what's already socially acceptable in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I usually recommend that you ask for what you need. You don't need to tie it to a medical condition or disability. Try asking for what you need. You need a more flexible work schedule. The employer doesn't necessarily need to know that you're going for counseling or you're going to see a psychiatrist or something like that. I mean, in the example that I used, where the psychiatrist was only available, I can't remember what it was, 2 days a week from 2 to 2:30, whatever, you could ask for it, and you are not required to bring up that it's disability related. But at the point at which the employer balks, or maybe it's a very formal workplace situation, and they say, well, we provide flexible work schedule, but we provide it as a reasonable accommodation for employees with disabilities, then you're going to need to disclose. But really, you don't need to disclose unless you're asking the employee for an accommodation and they're not just sort of willing to provide it. Yeah, I would say, it's tricky whether or not to disclose to your employer. And generally, I think if you don't need a reasonable accommodation, I don't see any reason to divulge private information about your medical situation.
Great, thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
And then you also had a question about, non-evident disabilities and sort of when is it appropriate and what kind of questions you can be asked. I think the other question that did come up prior to our presentation today was, does it matter if I'm an intern or a volunteer within an organization versus being a full-time or a regular employee? And are there differences in the circumstances and the obligations in that situation?
Well, yes and no. So the yes part of where it's different is the intern or the volunteer is not considered an employee. They don't have rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, probably the agency or the business or whatever it is a Title II or a Title III entity. So if it's a Title III entity, it would be like a nonprofit organization, something like that, or it could be a business. If they have a intern program, then they have obligations under Title III of the ADA to make sure that interns with disabilities and volunteers with disabilities can participate and have a right to reasonable accommodations. So it's not necessarily going to be under Title I of the ADA because they're not actually employees, but they're still going to have rights under the ADA for reasonable accommodation. It's just going to be different titles of the ADA, not Title I.
A question that we got also, Kathy, was around the application. Students talked about when they noticed when they applied for a position, there was a form as part of the application asking if they had a disability. And students were wondering, what happens if I click yes on that box? Does the employer get that information? Is that something that could help my application? Or is that something where I could be actually screened out of a job if I check that box?
Even when it says confidential or used for
Right.
documentation purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, some employers are, particularly if they're federal contractors, they are required to try to reach a goal of 7% of their employees have disabilities, and also to sort of prove they've got to show this to their federal agency that is in charge of contracts. So I've seen those questions often asked sort of in relationship to that. But I do think one thing you don't want to do is lie. So if it's a yes/no situation, you really need to answer yes. If it's a yes/no, I don't want to disclose situation, I don't see any reason to disclose unless you really think this is a disability-friendly employer and that it's going to really help your chances to get the job rather than sort of be a barrier to getting a job.
And that still allows you the right to disclose later should you find that it is important for you to do so to be successful in the role that you are accepting.
I'm sorry, say it again?
And it still allows you the right to come back and disclose later if you need to do so in order to be successful in your role, even if you don't do it initially in that checkbox.
Yeah, even if you don't do it initially in the checkbox, you can certainly tell the employer, at any point that you have a disability or you have medical condition or however you want to be presenting the information. But you shouldn't be checking no on the form. You shouldn't be lying if you have a disability. That's definitely a no-no.
Caitlin, do you have other questions that had come up? We've covered a lot.
Yeah, I think we've covered all the questions we got in.
The only other question might be, so you've given us a fantastic overview and a lot of great examples, I think, that people can think about transferably, but I know the question I often get is, this is all great, and I understand the guidelines now, but in my circumstances, how should I think about this? What would be your suggestions of next steps if people want to have a conversation or get connected? I know at Mount Holyoke, we invite students to connect with the Career Development Center if it's a workplace-oriented question around accommodation, and with Accessibility Services, if it's a classroom and on-campus experience. Beyond that, what other kind of resources might you suggest? I know in the past I had a recent alum a couple years ago who followed up and used the 800 number for the New England ADA, and it was actually fantastic. She was screening, she was applying into a graduate program that required placement, and they were, as part of the application process, asking a lot of questions about what your accommodation needs might be if we are placing you into environments during the graduate program. And she called the 800 number. We assumed we'd get New England, but she actually got the region that she was living in and where the program was going to be. And it was interesting because it allowed her to think about the state context as well as the federal context in making the decisions as how she was navigating what she was disclosing in her graduate school application. So it was a great resource. But are there things that you would suggest?
Well, other resources certainly, and I did you show the resources at the beginning? I can't remember.
Okay, I'll pop up the one that we had talked about.
Okay.
I just didn't know if there were other things you wanted to share too.
Well, certainly the New England ADA Center, the Job Accommodation Network is a really great resource. They will, they talk to employees, they talk to employers, they have unlimited ideas on possible reasonable accommodation. They will do individual consultations with employers or employees who are really trying to figure out what kind of accommodations they need in terms of, a particular job matching with a particular disability. Their website has disabilities from A to Z, so it's
It's been a
Right.
great brainstorming tool. I've had students take a look at it before they go to an interview where they know they want to have the conversation, not because they necessarily wanted to know this is the only thing I want to ask about, but because it allowed them to understand, oh, there's a lot of ways I can sort of solve this problem. And it helped them to be more prepared to participate in that informal participation conversation you were referencing earlier.
Yes, their website is really incredible. They have accommodation ideas for every kind of disability that you can imagine. So it definitely would give you, the employee really some good ideas of what's going to support them to do their job, and also what kinds of things they should be, suggesting to the employer. You're always welcome to call us. I'm not sure that there are really too many other resources out there. Certainly, if you're part of vocational rehabilitation, you could speak with your, voc rehab counselor. But that's pretty much what I'm familiar with. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Did we have other?
Caitlin?
Hmm?
Anything else to add?
I don't think so. This has been so great. Thank you so much, Kathy.
You're
We
welcome.
really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad that we covered, the issues. It's not an easy subject. It's not an easy situation to determine whether or not and when and to what extent you're going to disclose. But I can't emphasize enough, if you're going to be having problems at work, or if you are having problems at work and you think there are accommodations that are going to support you, do talk to your employer before things start to fall apart. You really want to catch that at the beginning.
And I guess this is a good moment for me to also mention that at Mount Holyoke College in the Career Development Center, if students are interested in having a conversation about topics about their accommodation or their workplace dynamics and how they're navigating in those spaces, we offer advising for this on a regular basis. They're individual advising appointments. We usually do it in 30-minute appointments, so it's private. And when you want to schedule the appointment, you don't have to disclose anything in the disclosure of requesting the appointment. You can simply say, I just want to speak with a career advisor. It's a private matter, or I'd like to speak with a career advisor about my personal work needs. We're not going to question or probe that at all. We're going to just schedule you directly with a professional career advisor to have that conversation. So we really encourage students to, you can start with us, and we can help connect you to other resources both on campus and outside of campus, like the New England ADA. But it's a great opportunity to have a conversation. And if you haven't, an internship and preparing for internship is a good opportunity to begin to practice having conversations about how you advocate, how do you identify and advocate for the things that are going to help you be most successful. And for many of you, you've already considered this in your classrooms and on-campus environments. And this next step into a workplace can be something that you haven't tried before. And we're happy to support you to do that. So I just want to extend a personal invitation to students to schedule a 30-minute appointment with a career advisor at the Career Development Center, and we'll help you go from there.
Fantastic. And I think I would just remind students that if you are thinking that you might need some accommodations in an on-campus job, that Accessibility Services is the place that you want to go to get that process started and to request any accommodations for an on-campus job.
And again, an on-campus opportunity is a great opportunity to be developing skills in a number of ways. And one of them is in advocating for what you know you need in order to be successful. So we want to encourage you to practice and test. And because you do it in one environment or one on-campus job or one internship does not mean you have to do it for all of them. It's really about a step-by-step process and learning it as a skill.
Absolutely.
Good.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Great working with
Thanks,
all of you.
everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.